Hey everyone, in this video I want to provide a quick peek at the new Premium SSD V2 that has just been announced. As always, this is useful, please like and subscribe. Now there are a number of different types of managed disks we have available in Azure to meet all the different types of scenarios we might have. There's standard hard disk drive, standard SSD, Premium SSD and Ultra disk. And they have different combinations of maybe maximum capacities, the amount of IOPS supported, the amount of throughput supported, and what is the latency. So based on our workload, we pick a different type of disk. Now realize when we think about those dimensions of capacity and IOPS and throughput, especially the IOPS and throughput, our requirements for a particular workload typically changes. There might be a certain seasonality, which could be daily. Hey, we have a peak time during the day where I need more performance on our storage. It could be a weekly batch job, a monthly analysis, even some annual type of interaction. So there are these variations in the performance we require of our underlying storage. If I was a database, maybe there's a big analysis job that runs once a week. So for a couple of hours, I need maybe a higher throughput. Maybe my operations are big, so it's not so much IOPS, but I need more throughput. Maybe I'm an authentication server, and for the first hour of the working day, I get lots of people authenticating. So again, more performance required on the disk that stores my authentication database. Now, when I think about the Premium SSD V1, so we're going to talk about this new V2. So if we think about the current status, so we have our Premium SSD V1. And we have those dimensions. I can think about the idea that absolutely I have my capacity, and then I have my idea of my performance. Now, when I think of performance, we're really thinking about things like IOPS, operations per second, and then our throughput. Now, I'm drawing it as one line for that performance, but realize they are different dimensions. I might have higher IOPS and lower throughput requirements. But the way this works today is if I think about those combinations, my Premium SSD can start at 4 gigabytes and can actually go all the way up to 32 tebibytes. And what happens is, really it scales linearly. As my disk gets bigger, so too does my performance. So we get these higher performances available as our disk gets bigger. Now that means I create a disk of a certain size. I might create the disk of a certain size because I need the capacity, or I might create it as a certain size because I need the corresponding IOPS or throughput that come with a disk of that capacity. So there's different reasons I pick a certain size. Now don't forget, I'm talking about the performance characteristics of the disk. You're going to connect to this disk from something like a virtual machine. Remember, the virtual machine has its own limits for things like storage throughput and storage IOPS. So make sure when you're trying to identify, look, what is the overall capability I need, I factor in whatever is connecting to the storage limits in addition to the storage limits itself. That's super, super important. So if I think about this on the old Premium SSD, as the disk got bigger, so too did the performance. If we go and quickly look at, for example, the selected disk type, and I was to look at Premium SSD, you can see the idea that as the disk size gets bigger, or the amount of provisioned IOPS goes up, as does the provisioned throughput. And obviously, the bigger we get the disk, the higher those numbers go. So we have this fairly linear type of escalation of the performance available to us. But sometimes I might need more than that performance. So one of the things they did is you had this idea of burst. Now I'm going to draw a little line on this picture because there's different types of Premium SSDs I could buy. And we're going to say, hey, our P P20. And our P20 was 512 gigabytes. So up to that 512 gigabytes, we had this idea of a burst. So I had a burst capability that was free for up to 30 minutes maximum. So this was really, think about a bucket. This was credit based. I started off with a full bucket of burst capability. If I was running below that provision performance, I would be filling my bucket. I'd be accruing credit. So then I could spike up my IOPS and or throughput up to 30 minutes or until my bucket was empty. So I had this, sure, I had a provisioned amount, but hey, up to 30 minutes for free, I can burst up. So that might be super useful if I had, for example, that authentication storm at the start of the day. Hey, I can just pick a certain disk size because I'll accrue throughout the rest of the day when my traffic is lower, the IOPS and throughput, and then I'll just burst up for free. So that's what we had with the P20 and below. For above the P20, it also had this idea of bursting, but it was called on demand. So it too had a burst level, but this burst I paid for. And I paid for it in two ways. So I would pay for it, firstly, I had to actually enable the ability to burst. So I'd pay a certain fee to be able to burst. And then depending on the amount I bursted up based on those transactions I performed above my target, I would pay for that. And we can see that in the pricing page. So if we jump back over for a second, if we go and look at the pricing, you can see at the bottom of the page, hey, there's a burst enablement fee. And then a transaction fee of this $0.005 for 10,000 transactions. So you have here, if you look at the details, hey, up to that P20, I can burst up to 3,500 and 170 megabytes per second. When I go past that P20, then you get into this much bigger 30,000 IOPS and 1,000 megabytes per second, but that's using that on demand. So I'm paying to have that capability. So I can see all of those details. Now, what about if it's maybe that smaller disk, or I don't want to use that on demand basis, but I need some higher performance? The other thing you could do with a Premium SSD V1 is you have a performance tier separate from the capacity. So one of the things I could actually do is say, well, you know what? I'm this capacity, but I want the performance as if I was this capacity. So I could take this and apply it to my disk. And that's using performance tier. Now you might say, why would I bother doing that? Why not just resize the disk to get that more capacity so then I get its performance? I can't shrink disks. I can only make disks bigger. And so if I resized my disk to a bigger capacity, yes, I would get the bigger performance, but I could never go back again. Whereas if I use this separate performance tier, the capacity stays the same. It doesn't resize my disk. I just get the associated performance of that higher capacity disk. Now I'm going to pay for what is that cost of the higher capacity disk, but it's not increasing my size. And once every 12 hours, I can shrink back down. So if I need it for a certain duration, maybe a day or two, it could be shorter, well, I can increase my performance tier, but I can bring it back down again afterwards. And we see this. If I was to go, for example, and look at my disks, and if I was to go and look at a regular premium disk, if we go to size and performance, yes, I have the size of my disk that I can select from all of these lists here, but I can also separately select the performance tier. So for a period of time, I could increase my performance tier up to a different disk, whichever performance I need. I would pay for now this higher disk, but it wouldn't resize my disk. And then when I'm finished with that higher workload, and I could even manage this programmatically, I could shrink it back down from the performance tier perspective to never actually resize the physical disk. So that's a very useful capability. So hey, I need a higher performance, maybe longer, or I need it more consistent than just that free bursting allows. So is that clear? I have all these different options. So Premium SSD V2 takes this to a completely different level. And it gives me a lot more flexibility, because if you look at this picture, maybe sometimes I actually just needed more capacity. I didn't actually need the higher performance. And obviously what I pay for is a factor of the capacity and the performance it's giving me. Well, maybe I just need the capacity. And sure, I want premium, so I want lower latencies, and I need a certain amount of IOPS and throughput, but I don't need this big level. So I'm, in a way, paying for performance I don't actually need or want. So in comes, I'm going to draw that same chart again. Here comes the idea of, we'll do it in our fancy pen, Premium. You know, I saved this pen for the really fancy stuff. So the Premium SSD V2. So kind of excitement around what this means. Once again, we have this same idea that I have my performance. And remember that performance is broken into those separate ideas of IOPS and throughput. And then once again, I have the idea of capacity. Those dimensions are never going anywhere. I need a certain amount I can store, capacity, and then I need certain performance, hey, operations per second, and then the throughput. And obviously there's latency as well. We're going to get to that. So this time my capacity can really range from as small as 1 gigabyte all the way up to 64 terabytes. So my capacity potentially is doubled from what the 32. And I can go up in increments of 1 gigabyte, so I have a lot of flexibility here. But here's where it starts to change in a pretty massive level. What is my performance I get as my capacity increases? Well, what actually happens here is I have a baseline performance that's the same. I always get included in the price of my disk 3,000 IOPS and 125 megabytes per second. So that's just baseline. No matter how big my disk, I always get that included as part of my price. But then what happens is I have this maximum IOPS and throughput that is available to me to configure. So when I start off, let's say about here, we get this line all the way up to here. So this is the max configurable. I pick what I want. So the idea now is when I create this disk, I pick the capacity I want. Now, the bigger the disk, the higher this possibly can be, because I'm going to get a range. I now have a range available. Think of it as 2 dials. I have a dial for IOPS and a dial for throughput. What I can set that dial to depends on the size of the disk. The bigger the disk, yes, my potential max IOPS and max throughput does increase as the disk gets bigger, but I don't have to. I can say, hey, maybe I'm creating a disk here, but my IOPS I'll only set here, my throughput I'll only set there. I can tune it to exactly what I want. So I don't potentially pay for performance I don't need. Or I might go to a very high performance, even for a fairly small disk. And what's great about this as well is this is dynamic. I can change this provisioned IOPS and change this provisioned throughput at any time. So it's connected to a VM, it's running, oh, I'm coming up to that busy period, I'm going to increase the IOPS. Maybe I need to increase the throughput as well. okay, that busy time's finished, I'm going to turn these back down. If you've used UltraDisk, this will seem super, super familiar because UltraDisk uses that same pattern. I have a dial for my capacity, and I have a dial for my IOPS, and I have a dial for my throughput. So the Premium SSD V2 is moving to that option. I now have that flexibility. I can pick, hey, yeah, I need the capacity, and maybe I do need really high performance, or maybe I don't. I have all of those things available to me. Now, there is a maximum, as we'll see if we look at the documentation. So if I jump over and actually look at the Premium SSD V2, what it will show you is essentially, as this documentation is wrong, it goes up to 64 tebibytes, not 64 gigabytes. But it goes all the way up to 80,000 IOPS and 1,200 megabytes per second. And you can see it's increasing. So for every gigabyte I make it bigger, it goes up by 500 IOPS. So those maximums go up. And the pricing page actually shows this pretty nicely as well. It talks about the max IOPS, the max throughput. So as I make the disks bigger and bigger, it gives me examples at the start. Hey, it's 3,750. Then those maximums increase as it goes up in gigabytes. And then, hey, it's 500 for gigabyte, all the way up to once I hit 160, 80,000 and 1,200 is the maximum. But that's the range. I don't have to use those numbers if I don't want to. It's just available to me. The whole point now is I get that flexibility. And maybe it's actually easier, let's jump back over for a second, to see this. Now, if I actually go and create a disk, so I'm going to be in East US, it is in preview right now, so it's only certain regions. And as you'll see, the Premium SSD V2 have to be created as zonal, so they have to be in a certain zone. But if I leave it as the regular Premium SSD, you'll notice, well, based on the size, I get this very strict IOPS and throughput, and we can see that bursting is available. But if I change it to Premium SSD V2, there are no different disk sizes. I tell it the size of the disk I want, and based on that, hey, my maximum will vary. But I absolutely will just go and pick, hey, what size do I want? How many IOPS do I want? And how much throughput do I want? I have complete control over those. And likewise, if it was an existing disk, and let's say it's connected and it's running, I can still change it. So once it's created and it's connected through, I could go and increase the IOPS, increase the throughput, or decrease them. So I have that complete control over all of those things. So this is one of those capabilities now that, hey, it really changes how I might think about the storage I need for my different workloads. So the mechanism in which we use it is completely different to the V1. Now, there are some other differences. If we were to think about, hey, the V1 versus the V2, the latency is different. So if we go over here, if we think about the Premium SSD V1, it talks a lot about the idea of single millisecond latencies. So we think, okay, single millisecond latency. Whereas in the SSD V2, it's sub-millisecond latency, which is part of the reason it has to be zonal. I want the VM connecting to the disk to be in the same availability zone. So now I'm going to get this sub-millisecond latency. I get more flexibility. And I would say simplicity as well, that I now just, hey, what's the capacity I want? What's the IOPS I want? What's the throughput I want? And I can change those as I need to. And I do get higher capacity and performance available to me. Once again, if we go and look at the summary of the disks, if we just look at that documentation, go all the way to the top, we can see the Premium SSD V2 versus V1. Well, the maximum size is double for the V2, and the maximum performance Well, for the IOPS, it's much, much higher. And the throughput is still sort of a third higher than what I could do with the V1. So I'm getting a lower latency, and I'm getting higher capacities, and I'm getting a better performance available to me. And I get the flexibility of, well, I only need the performance that I actually want for what I'm doing. So now you may ask, well, why is there the Ultra Disk then? So what are the differences when I think about the Premium SSD then versus Ultra Disk? And so if I think about Ultra Disk, if I think Premium SSD V2 is sub-millisecond latency, well, here we talk about a sub-half a millisecond latency. So the latency is less still. And these disks have higher IOPS and throughput available to me. So once again, if we looked at that documentation page for a second, if we look at the Ultra Disk, well, here I can see my max IOPS is double. I can go up to 160,000 IOPS, and my throughput goes up to 4,000 megabytes per second. So those are significantly higher than what I can do even with the Premium SSD V2. Notice, Premium SSD V2 is not available for the OS disk. So this really is focused around those data disks format. Now, we don't know the pricing yet. I would expect it's going to be very similar to the way that Ultra Disks is structured. The cost won't be the same, but the structure I would expect to be very similar. And what that means is you pay a certain amount for the capacity, you pay a certain amount for the provision IOPS per hour, certain amount of provision throughput megabytes per second per hour. So I'd expect it to be very, very similar in structure, but again, not in terms of the actual money paid. But because of this flexibility, well, I'm going to get a different billing model. So it's now not just based on, well, what's the disk or the performance tier? It's based on, what do I have these dials turn to at any particular point in time, based on what are my requirements at that point in time. Now, just to stress the point again, when I use these, if we think about a region, most of the time now we see our regions are actually divided up into availability zones. Remember, availability zones are the idea that there are certain sets of data centers that have independent power, different substations, cooling, networking from other availability zones. So it helps me protect myself from a certain event. It has a certain blast radius. So when I think about using this Premium SSD V2, I have to deploy them as zonal resources, i.e. they're pinned and created in a specific zone for my subscription. So if I create my Premium SSD V2 in AZ1, well, then the VM or whatever workload is going to use it, that's going to be also created in AZ1, and we'll use that. So just kind of an important point to understand about these disks. But that was really it. So again, it's in preview as I'm recording this, but obviously, so it's limited regions today. There's a sign-on to actually go and get part of the preview. But the key point around this is it's really evolving the story. With Premium SSD V1, we had a lot of different mechanisms in terms of bursting and maybe taking a performance tier. Premium SSD V2 just gives you the flexibility. Hey, I pick the capacity I want, and I pick the performance in terms of IOPS and throughput I want, and I can change that when I need to. I do get sub-millisecond latency, so there's a latency improvement over Premium SSD V1, but these will definitely be zonal resources. They get created in a specific zone, they'll get used by a resource in that same zone. So that was it. I hope that clears up maybe confusion about what is this Premium SSD V2 thing. I think it really is a huge step. And until next video, take care.